Marcia Laycock lives in High River, Alberta, and we've known each other, I want to guess, maybe 20 years, for a long time in the writing circles. And our paths have crossed in person now and again. She's invited me out to her church to speak in the fall, and I'm excited to be able to go do that. And I'll see her in person again. But Marcia has just recently released a book called Ponderings, and it's a memoir of her coming to faith and her writing journey and how God has led step by step in her life. And so she's going to share that with us. As she shares, I want you all to be, um, I know her story will bless you. And she's going to talk about her writing. And I know that not everybody's a writer, but it's just really fun to hear how God leads people using the gifts that he gives them. And so, no matter what your gifting is, uh, know that he is able to use you too. So, right within your circle, in your neighborhood, in your church, wherever he plants you, he wants to use you to build his kingdom. And so, Marcia, welcome tonight. And I want you to just feel free to share your heart with us. I know the women are going to enjoy hearing your story. So, we're going to do this just like a little bit of an interview. So, we're going to start with this question. Tell us a little bit about your life. For instance, where all have you lived? You are a Canadian girl who's been all over the place.
Yes, I've had an interesting life. I remember the night before I married my husband, his brother kind of walked up to me and said, "Well, I just have to say one thing to you. If you stick with my brother, you'll never be bored." And he was very, very correct. Um, but it hasn't all been up to my husband where we've gone. The Lord has led us to many different places, and it's kind of funny. I was saying to someone just the other day that when my mother discovered that I had called her and told her that my husband was about to become a pastor, and the first thing she said was, "Well, you'll never be rich." And that sort of made me laugh. And when I hung up, I thought, she's probably right. And I sort of was thinking of all the things that, we might not be able to enjoy anymore. And one of them was traveling. I thought, our traveling days were probably over. But that certainly was not true. I began my life in Ontario. So hello to all those Ontario folks that have joined us tonight. Um, I was raised on an island on the north shore of Lake Huron and went to school in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And then from there, I ended up going to university in Ottawa, to Carleton University, where I studied journalism for a time. And then I ended up in the far north, wandered up to Alaska and the Yukon. And that's where I met my husband. And that's where I came to know the Lord. And then the adventure began. We went from there to Saskatchewan to go to Bible college, and then from there to Alberta for a time, pastoring a rural church in central Alberta. And we were also privileged to be on the mission field for a time in Papua New Guinea. So it's I think I say on my website that I really, because I was raised on the Great Lakes, right between the two biggest of the lakes, the Lake Superior and Lake Huron, I love large bodies of water. So there's a lot of water in my stories usually, and a lot of winter because we lived in the north for so long. But then we were in the South Pacific, so there's a few palm trees thrown in there as well. So it's kind of made a very interesting pool of information and kind of fodder for my writing, being able to go to various different places. We've been to Israel twice, been to Europe. So it's just been tremendous the way the Lord has led us from one place to another. I think right from the very beginning, when I was as a young child, I went through some trauma and then became a rebellious teenager who rejected God because I was sure that he had rejected me. and then went off to university, but was very lonely there and ended up, as I said, wandering up to Alaska for a time and then into the Yukon. It was one of those times that when I left the Yukon to come down to Saskatchewan to Bible college, I remember leaving. We had built an eight-sided log house on the banks of the Klondike River and had lived there for 6 years. And I remember as I left there thinking, oh, I'll probably never own a house again. And again, that was not true either. The Lord provided in so many different ways as we went into ministry. His direction was just a constant flood of blessings over and over and over again.
Mm. And Marcia, it's when you were up north that you came to faith in Christ. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. Yes, we were in Dawson City, that's kind of a misnomer because it's really just a small town. The population jumps in the summertime with the tourism, but there's probably, well, when we first went there in the early 70s, there were maybe 500 people who lived there at that time. So it was a small town, but a very young town. A lot of young people who came up to work through the summer because they could work 2 and 3 jobs because there was 24-hour daylight up there. So everybody was just buzzing, all just going, working to get enough money to go back to school or to do whatever they wanted to do. So it was quite an interesting place to land. And it was at that time in our lives, neither of us really had any direction. We were literally wandering in the wilderness. But the Lord got a hold of us through some pretty incredible circumstances. Um, the first part of the story deals with the suicide of my husband's best friend and his mining partner. So 2 young men, they were just in their mid-20s, committed suicide, and that totally rocked our world. And it seemed like everywhere we went after that, there was death all around us. And we didn't cope with it well. Neither of us had experienced that before. And so we weren't coping with it well. Went off to California for our honeymoon at one point and met a very unusual man who called himself a Christian, but he had some very strange ideas. But he gave us both a book and said that books would be very important in our spiritual journey. And I scoffed at that in my mind because I thought, well, my husband wasn't a reader at that time, for one thing. And I thought, there's no way, we are not on any kind of spiritual journey. But he was right. Both of those books did have an influence on us and pointed us in the right direction. And my husband began meeting with the man who performed our wedding ceremony. We weren't believers, but he was gracious and allowed us to do what we wanted to do with the wedding ceremony. And I think we had our vows consisted of a Buddhist saying, and it was just a jumble of lostness. But when the suicides happened and my husband began to read the book that he'd been given, and he had a lot of questions about it. So he took it to Pastor Jack. His name was Pastor Jack Saylor. And Pastor Jack said, well, give me the book, I'll read it, and we'll get together and talk about it. So they began doing that. And Pastor Jack met with Spence at least once a week. He'd come to where Spence was working on his lunch hour and talk with him and talk about the book. And over time, Spence came home one day and said he wanted to go to church. And I was shocked and I was not happy at that. And I just sort of said, well, okay, if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it. But don't count me in on that. I had been raised in a Catholic home that was nominally Catholic. But I was very convinced that God had rejected me, that he did not want anything to do with me. And so rather than believe that he had rejected me, I convinced myself he didn't exist. But to make this could be a very long story, but to cut it short, um, the Lord gave me the one desire of my heart, and that was a baby girl. She was born on November 30th, 1982, and it was a miracle because we had been together for about 5 years at that point. I desperately wanted a baby. All my friends had children, um, but it wasn't happening. And so we decided to look into adoption. Went to see some people about it, and they advised us to go and have some tests done to determine why we couldn't conceive a child. And so we did that. We went down to what was then Shaughnessy Hospital in Vancouver, had a whole bunch of tests done, and they basically said adoption is your best option. You will, they didn't say definitely, but they said it's extremely unlikely that you will ever have a child together. They called it chemical incompatibility. So we decided, okay, well, let's do the adoption thing, and went back to Dawson. But then they told us that it was going to take 8 years to get a baby. And that just made me more angry. And I was sure that this God I didn't believe in was punishing me, was, deliberately sabotaging my life. But then one day my husband got up to go to church, and I said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I had gone with him a few times, but I said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to visit my friend Brenda. We're going to have a good time weaving. She's gotten a new loom. We're going to set that up and have a good weekend. So I rushed off to visit my friend, and Spence challenged me to try and articulate what I did believe about God. And he asked me a whole bunch of questions, and I didn't want to think about those questions, but I couldn't get them out of my head. And so as I was driving along, I just got really frustrated with it all, pulled over on a lookout spot over the Stewart River, and sat there for a time and just started talking to God, to this God that I said I didn't believe existed. And he showed me that he was real. He gave me the desire of my heart with that little tiny baby. And I remember the day that I realized that what everyone was telling me, I had morning sickness, and everybody was telling me that I was pregnant, I was going to have a baby. And I kept saying, no, it's not possible. The experts have said no. And then that one day I was having morning sickness, and I realized that what they were telling me was true, that I was pregnant. And it's one of the few times in my life that I was absolutely certain. I knew God had done this. And that was the beginning of me turning toward him and yielding to him. And it was such a wonderful thing that Spence and I both came to Christ almost at the same time. That was a real blessing.
Marcy, when I hear your testimony like that of coming to faith as an adult, I think that's a different kind of story than mine, or probably many others here who came to faith as a child. And I think when I hear a story like yours, I'm just so blessed because it encourages me to keep praying for others that I know who don't know the Lord yet, and they are into their adult years. And it sometimes looks like there's just no hope, and why even keep praying? But your story just encourages me to not give up because God is at work and he's able to do whatever he wants to draw that person to himself or to show his power in some way that will turn that heart around. And so thank you for responding to him as an adult and then for sharing your story with us, because I'm sure it's an encouragement to many on here tonight to keep praying for that loved one.
Yes, never give up praying, never give
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
And I've heard someone say that often the people that seem the furthest away may actually be the closest.
Mm.
They're
Just
just
yeah.
inches
Well,
from accepting the Lord.
I think so often we have that assumption that, oh, they're not really interested anyways. And that might not be true at all, because as I heard
Mhm.
you say, you pulled over, you were just really frustrated, or you couldn't get those questions out of your mind that Spencer had asked you. And so we never know what's going on in somebody's mind and in somebody's heart. And so carry on. Thank you. And so,
Amen.
how did your writing career start?
Well, I began writing when I was very young. I kind of talk a bit about that in my memoir ponderings. Our home was rather stressful, and so I used to go up into my bedroom and write little poems and short stories for my dolls, and they didn't complain, so I kept doing it. And then I was privileged to have a lot of good teachers who really encouraged me along the way. And when I was 11 years old, my aunt gave me a book by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Wasn't one of the Anne books, it was an Emily book, Emily of New Moon. And in that book, Emily calls herself a writer. And that's when I realized that, oh, you could actually call yourself a writer. And I determined that that's what I was going to be at the age of 11. I was going to be a writer someday. And then the Lord just led in some pretty amazing ways through that time, opened doors that I would certainly not have been able to open myself, and often just would put something into my lap and say, here you go, this is the next step. And it was just a blessing to sit down and write that memoir. It began, the memoir got started when Marg Gibb, with not Women Alive, Women Together Ministries. She has a podcast called Fresh Words, and she interviews authors of all kinds and has discussions with them about their faith and their writing. And I did this interview with Marg, and as I put that together, I was just really humbled by what God had done in my writing life for over a span of, more than 30 years now. And my publisher at the time, I published a little children's book with Serotonin Creative Publishing, and you can see that's the little book right there. My Colleen McCubbin, who's the owner of that publishing company, heard the interview, and she said, you have to write a memoir. She said, you really need to sit down and write a writer's memoir. And so I started doing that, and I used the base of that interview. And, it was kind of funny as I went through it, because I'd look at a section of the interview and sort of think, okay, well, that's part of it. But how can I expand this? I need to expand it because this isn't enough for a book. And I started just praying to the Lord, tell me what you want me to put in this book. Lead me to the stories that I should include. And he certainly did that over and over and again. I'd sort of get to a point and think, okay, well, that's kind of it. And then something else would come into my mind, and oh yeah, I have to include this, and before I knew it, I had 50 some thousand words, which was enough to do the memoir. So it was just a real blessing to me. And as I said, very humbling to realize that the God of the universe, has been, involved in my life from the very beginning and has led me in so many different ways to be involved in his building of the kingdom on earth. And that's a tremendous privilege.
I think you said something just a moment ago that most people will resonate with here, and that is you said something about just step by step. You just did one step at a time, and God would open the doors. And I think sometimes when we're looking at, oh, what is God's purpose for my life, or what does He want me to do now in the season that I am in, we might tend to look at it as this whole big picture, and we can't figure it out because we can't see how it's going to get from point A to point B. There's too many pieces involved. We can't figure it out. But I think you nailed it when you said it was one step at a time, and that's all we can do, right? One step at a time. Just take that next step
Yes.
as God leads, and then He will show us the next step when we need to know. And it's not always easy to wait,
Absolutely.
but when He's leading the way, the timing is right, and he opens the doors at just the right time, and we can trust him to do that. And your memoir is it's very, very clearly shows how he went ahead of you and opened those doors. It's exciting to read. So,
Yeah, it really, so
no, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, let me ask this other question first, though, before I go on to another one. And that is, you've written your memoir. Uh, you talked about how it's like, how am I going to do this? But just trusting and praying, and God give you the words, and then you had 50,000 words, and that was enough to publish the book. Uh, and it's very well written. So, do you coach other people in how to write memoirs? Like, have you ever thought of doing that?
Um, I have done a little bit of that. I've taught short workshops and done a couple of things online. I kind of, in a way, I sort of think it's, I really don't have the credibility to do this in a way because I've only written this one little memoir. But I have taken some courses. There's another woman who's involved with Serotonin Creative Publishing, and she's in this the she's written one memoir and in the process of writing her second. And she did a course through Serotonin that I took and that I really found valuable. And so I just sort of pass on what I know. I'm not an expert at it because I've only done it once. But just having taken some courses and done some reading and researched a bit, I pass on what I know that I think will help people to do it because I think it's a very valuable thing to do and it's a very popular genre right now. People are interested in reading memoirs. So there is an audience out there. And I think it's really an important thing to do, especially for people of faith, to tell their story, because there will be other people out there who are maybe struggling with things that you struggled with and, feeling the same doubts that you had and all of those things that we go through in our lives. And if we are willing to be vulnerable and let those things out into the public genre, into the public sphere, they can be really influential, really helpful to people.
And you were pretty honest in your story about some of that trauma that you experienced as a young girl. And I, how was that for you in writing that in a memoir? Like, was that the first time that you kind of went public with that, or had you told other
To
people
some
about that
extent,
before?
to some extent, yes. Years and years ago, when my very first book came out, Spur of the Moment, it's a devotional book. And that was one of the stories I tell in the book of how God led me to that to put that first book together. Um, when I was putting it together and looking for opportunities to let people know about it, I was asked to be on Huntley Street. And this was way back, I think it was in 2002 that I published that book. So I was interviewed on that show, and I had given them, some details of my life beforehand. And the woman who was interviewing me, she really kind of blindsided me in a way because she didn't tell me she was going to do this, but her very first question was about the sexual abuse that I had gone through. And so, all of a sudden there it was out there.
Mm.
So that was a little bit traumatic for me in a way, but it was a good thing. It needed to happen. And it is hard sometimes to write about those things, like the little bit that I give in the memoir. Um, it does trigger you when you start, recounting those things happening to you. Um, so it is uh, it can be really difficult to do. But I think it's important. It's important to be authentic and real with your audience and to be vulnerable, to let them know that, you've gone through things and you have struggles and, there's a way through those things.
Mhm. And at the same time, I've heard it said that there is a time to write about struggles that we've had and a time to not, because if we have not yet worked through some of that stuff, it can come out in a, what do you say, like in a real negative way, where it's not going to help people, but it could just hurt more than it can help anybody, right? If we're writing out of anger and we're writing out of um, spite or uh, hear what I'm saying on that? Like there has to be a measure of healing that's happened before we're actually
Mhm.
ready to put it on paper. Have you heard that
Mhm.
same thing?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's very, very true. I have a friend who lives in Calgary. Uh, I do have a copy of her book right here, if I can pull it out without spilling my entire pile over. It's called The Ninth Child, and it's a book about difficult things. And Lisa LeBlanc is the lady who wrote it, and she said one time she was doing some teaching on writing this memoir, and she said you need to write from the not from the wounds, but from the scars. And I thought that was a really insightful thing that, yeah, you can't rip open that wound again. You have to get to the healing part before you start to put it down.
Teresa Moyer has written a memoir as well, and she just put in the chat, you write from your scars so you do not bleed all over the page.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's a good
Yeah.
way to put it. Yeah, yeah. Well, you did not bleed all over the page with yours, but obviously, like as you've walked people through what God has done in your life, it's just an encouragement, I think, so that anybody else who picks up that book and reads it will look at that and go, "There's a whole lot of hope for me too." Marcia came through it, and I can too. So,
Hmm.
where do you get your ideas when you write? Because you've written both fiction and nonfiction. So, when you sit down to write, where do your ideas come from?
Well, that's one of the most common questions people ask me as a writer, and I think other writers too. We hear this question a lot, and it's a difficult one to answer because my ideas come from very many different sources. They come from things I see as I'm out in the world. They come from things I hear. They come from sometimes from my husband's sermons. He's been a pastor for 30 some years and was retired, but has just now been pulled back into pastoring again. So it's a new adventure again. But there are a lot of different sources, and one of the quotes that I think I'm becoming known for it because I tell people about it so often, but it's Elizabeth Barrett Browning's quote, where she says that the earth is crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God, but only those who see take off their shoes. The rest sit round and pluck blackberries. And I just love that quote because that's kind of my theme in a way as I go about my life, that I try to keep my eyes open and my ears open to see and to hear what God is pointing out to me. I think I said in the memoir, sometimes it feels sort of like God, like with a little child, you take their face and turn their face to what you want them to see. And sometimes that's what it feels like, that God has things there he wants me to see and that he wants me to record.
I get that feeling. You're a devotional writer like me, and so it's really hard to go through life without seeing God in so many different things. I'll see a bald eagle, and I'm like, oh yeah, I think of the scripture that goes with that, and I immediately think of a devotional that can go with it. It's hard not to view life through those eyes, isn't it? And he's put you together like
Hmm.
that.
Absolutely. And I think, we're just wired that way. I
Yeah.
think I love that scripture that talks about the Lord knitting us together in our mother's wombs. And, I think that's where it begins. He's made us to be this way
Hmm.
for a purpose, for his purpose.
So how does your faith play a role in your writing? How has that shaped your writing?
Well, it is now the basis of all of my writing. It When I think of what I was doing before I became a believer, as I said, it was like wandering in the wilderness. Literally, it had no purpose. It was, disjointed and um, not worth doing, really. Um, I was blessed. One of the times that the Lord put me in a place where He opened my eyes was at a seminar that was done by Carol Kent at Briarcrest. Just as we were getting ready to leave Briarcrest, Carol came and did a seminar called Speak Up with Confidence. And a friend of mine literally almost dragged me to go to that. I wasn't really interested because I thought, oh, I'll never be a public speaker, me of little faith. And but she convinced me to go. And as Carol talked about speaking, of course, she talked a lot about writing because you have to write before you speak. And it was like the proverbial light bulb going off in my brain. I suddenly realized I've had this passion for writing all my life, and now I can do it for the building of the kingdom of God. There's purpose to it now. Now I understand why I'm like this. So it was really a light bulb moment. And then just shortly after that, when we left Briarcrest and ended up in the small rural church in Pinoka, Alberta, my husband came home after speaking with the previous pastor, who had been kind of a one-man show. He did everything from make coffee to run off the bulletin on this ancient Gestander in the church. And just as they were getting up to leave, Pastor Don said, oh, by the way, I almost forgot to tell you, you have to write a faith column every week, and it's due tomorrow. And, and my husband came home and was a little bit, his head was just spinning. And he sort of said, do you think you could do this? Could you write something up and take it down to the paper? And I said, okay, yeah, I could do that. So I sat down and I wrote a devotional, took it down to the paper, and the editor kind of glanced at it and said, yeah, this is fine. And that was the beginning of a 20-year run of writing a faith column in that community. And I was blessed so many times through that time. That's how I ended up doing the first book, Spur of the Moment. My column was called The Spur, taken from Hebrews 10:23. Let us therefore consider how to spur one another on to love and good deeds. And we were in the middle of cowboy country, so I thought Spur of the Moment, that'll be a good name for the book. And I got talked into doing this book by a man named Gus Henney. Did you ever meet Gus,
I
Grace?
did, yes.
He
Gus and
was just a
Burl.
lovely man.
Hmm.
Yes, Gus and Burl. I met him at a writers' conference, and we got chatting about what I was doing. And he convinced me that it would be a good idea to do this book. People had been asking me to put the column into a book, but I was very nervous about doing it. Knowing that people have self-published and have boxes of books in their garages that they'll never be able to sell. But he convinced me, and my husband encouraged me, and the Lord kept prodding me. And eventually I did that first book. And that book is now in the third printing. It's gotten, it keeps getting expanded. So it's a little thicker than it used to be. But again, it was just the Lord's leading, putting me in the right place at the right time, and then opening the door, showing me what he wanted me to do with it.
That's great. So, do you have a poem or a body of work that you are uh, that's your favorite? Something that you've done?
Um, Again, that's a question that people often ask, and it's a hard one to answer. Because
Oh, but that might be asking
once you
like which child is your favorite, right?
yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like that for sure. But I think if I had to pick, I probably would pick my first novel, One Smooth Stone. just because of the responses there has been to that book. I've had some tremendous responses, both to that one and to Spur of the Moment has been that way too. People will email me or send me letters or even call on the phone and tell me how something that they read in those books um, changed their lives in some way. And, you know, that always brings me to tears when that happens. When the first box of Spur of One Smooth Stone landed on my doorstep, I opened it up, and the first book I took out, I gave to my friend who was the secretary at our church at the time. And she had a daughter who had been through some very difficult things. She had been raped as a young teen and she was very angry at God and angry with the world. And her mom kept giving her books and music and anything that she thought might help to bring her back to the Lord. But nothing really had worked very well. And I remembered, you know, praying with her so many times because she just wasn't seeing anything happening in this girl's life. But she gave One Smooth Stone to her daughter. And her daughter said she looked at it and thought, oh, yeah, there goes mom again with the God stuff. And she took it home and put it on a shelf, never intending to read it. But she got the flu and her TV wouldn't work. And she had nothing else in the house to read but One Smooth Stone. So she started reading it and she called her mom at midnight and said, Mom, I just finished this book. And I want you to know that I believe now that God does love me in spite of everything. And that, you know, when she told me that story, I was just weeping. It made everything worthwhile. And when you know that these things are causing people to get closer to the Lord, to sometimes to turn to the Lord for the very first time, it makes everything worth it.
Can you tell us what One Smooth Stone is about for those who don't know?
Sure, yeah, it's a story that, and again, it's one of those times when the Lord, you know, said, "Look at this, listen to this, and do something with it." There was a woman who came to our church to talk about the Crisis Pregnancy Center in Red Deer, and I was chatting with her in the lobby afterwards, and we were talking about abortion, the abortion issue. And she said something that just would not go away. It just stuck in my brain and wouldn't leave. And she said, can you imagine what it would be like for someone to discover his mother had tried to abort him, but the abortion failed? And a character began to emerge in my mind. And it was, I talk about this a bit in the book too, that I came to a point in my life where I was writing fiction and was totally obsessed with it, and God told me to stop. So I did for a time, and it was very hard. But when this character started to emerge in my head, I prayed and I asked the Lord, you know, are you releasing me now to write fiction again? And he began to show me that, yes, this was what he wanted me to do. He gave me a time and a place to do that work. And within the year, that book had been finished. So it's about a young man who is running away from his past life. He's running away from the police. He's running away from God. And he comes into a place where he is confronted over and over again with the goodness of God. And eventually he just can't resist it anymore. And he becomes a believer. There's other threads running through the book, but that's the main kind of theme of the book.
Mhm.
And then I wrote a sequel to that book called A Tumbled Stone, and it's his sister's story. They were both in foster care as children. So he discovers he has a sister and goes looking for her. And that book deals quite heavily with the abortion issue.
Hey, Marcy, we just have a few minutes left, so I want to leave some time for anybody who may have a question for you about your books. First, so I don't forget, if people want to get more information about your books, where would you send them? What's the best
Probably
place?
the best place is just the go to my website,
Okay.
which is marcialeelaycock.com. Um,
I've
and
added
they,
that in the chat
Well,
for
Bridget's
everyone.
good. She's already got it. Yeah, I
uh,
see it there.
thank you, Bridget.
Yeah.
All of my books are pretty much all of my books are listed there. A lot of my big books are on Amazon as well. So if you're from the States, you might want to go to Amazon. Um, or you can contact me if you live in Canada. Just contact me directly. Bridget, maybe you could put my email address in there too if you like. It's just Vinemark, Vinemarc at telus.net. So if you'd like me to send you a book, I have quite a few of them here in my house. So I'd be happy to send you one if you'd like to do that.
All
And
right.
I am also writing quite a bit lately on Substack, if you're familiar
Oh,
with that platform. So if you go into Substack, just substack.com, and then put my name into the search field, it will pop up. I've got quite a bit of writing on there now, including some excerpts from the memoir, if you're interested.
very good. Thank you for that. All right. If anybody has a question for Marcia, go ahead and put it in the chat box here.
Just want to make sure that I got the right email for you. VINEMARC@telus.net.
That's right.
Okay, perfect. It's in the chat for everyone there.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Yeah. Any questions for Marcia about her books or about what she's doing now? Somebody says you have 3 daughters, not just one.
Yes, yes. When the Lord fixes things, he fixes them very well, because we had 2 more daughters after that. And my husband calls them our mileposts, because Katie was born when we became Christians. Laura was born when we made the decision to go to Briarcrest. And our third daughter was born when we took on the pastorate for the first time.
You
And
have
now they all have wonderful partners. So we have 3 wonderful sons-in-law as well.
and grandchildren?
Yes, 2 little ones. Our little Thea is 5, and the little guy his name is Spencer Mark, so I call him Sparky, and he's just 3 years old. So they are a delight to us. Of course, they're just very precious.
Kathy says, what is your third daughter's name again?
Our third one is Megan.
Megan.
So it's Katie, Laura, and Megan.
Any children's books?
Yes, yes, I do have this little one that's, you can kind of see it over here. Maybe I'll just grab a copy. Can have a better look. It's called Marigold's Very Best Home. And it's about a little girl. This one came from a discussion I had with my daughter, Laura, who has the grandkids. And Laura was always a minimalist. And then she went off to the mission field, was in Bangladesh for a time with SIM. And when she came home from there, she was a flaming minimalist. And then she had children, and she was talking about how difficult it was to be that, to sustain that lifestyle, and to try and get the kids to not want things, constantly, to not want the newest thing, to not want, the things. They don't watch TV very much, but just that a whole consumerism, she was trying to prevent that from overtaking their lives. So we were talking about that, and then we got talking about some of the antics that she and her older sister got up to, and the time when her older sister Katie decided to run away from home because she was upset with me about something. And so she packed a little suitcase and trotted off to her best friend's house, which was just half a block from where we lived. And we were laughing about that. And as I was driving home that day, I was trying to think, of a way to maybe combine those two ideas into a children's book. And Marigold's Very Best Home is the result. And it's wonderfully illustrated by, you can see some of the illustrations. I don't know if you can see that well, but the illustrations are really wonderful. A lady named Kyla Weeb, who lives in Winnipeg, did the illustrations for me. And again, how I found her was another God incident, that he just put us together. And it's been doing quite well. I've had some really precious pictures that some of the parents send me pictures of. One lady even sent me a little video of this little guy, probably about 4 or 5 years old, and he's Asian, and English is obviously his second language. So but got this lovely little high pitched voice, and he's reading the book, and it's just a delight. I open that up every now and then just to encourage myself because it's so delightful to watch. So it's been
Somebody
really fun doing that book.
somebody asks, for what ages would that book be?
From 3 to about 7.
Okay. I have a
Though
whole bunch
I
of
read the
grandkids.
manuscript to
I have a whole bunch in that age
I
bracket.
read the all right. I read the manuscript to my granddaughter when she was 2. And when I asked Laura if I could do that, and she said, "Oh yeah, Mom, but I don't know if she'll be able to stick with it without any pictures or anything, because I didn't have the illustrations yet." But I decided to try it, and Thea was just glued to the story. She just didn't flinch at all. She was just listening intently. And now that we have the pictures, of course, it's even easier for them to concentrate. So it could even be from 2 to 7, but generally 3 to 7 is a good range.
Somebody asks, what year were you at Briarcrest?
We left the Yukon in 1985, and left Briarcrest in 88. Spence did the 4-year pastoral program in 3 years, so we were just there for 3.
Okay. And somebody says, thank you, Marcia, for sharing your journey with the Lord, especially the fact that your faith is the purpose of your writing. Recognizing the ability of writing is God's gift and glorifies him while giving hope to someone is beautiful. And somebody else
Amen.
says, do you have any plans for your books being translated into other languages?
My first book, Spur of the Moment, is in Spanish somewhere in South America. I think it's South America. It might be Mexico. I got an email one time from a fellow who was like, you could tell his English was his second language, but he wrote and asked if he could translate one of my devotionals that he'd seen online. And so I said, absolutely, that's, go ahead and do that. And then he contacted me a little bit later and said, I see you have a book. Could I translate your book? And I said, sure, why not? So I sent him the manuscript of Spur of the Moment. So it is floating around somewhere down there, but I've lost track of him completely. And I tried contacting him once, but couldn't get through to him. So Spur of the Moment is down there somewhere in Spanish. But I haven't looked at that. Translating is quite expensive to do generally. So I haven't really pursued that very much.
I've
But
had
it
some
would
of
be
my,
lovely to have that done for sure.
yeah, what I've learned too about translating, even when working with a traditional publisher, uh, for instance, a company came and asked if they could translate my Moving from Fear to Freedom into Polish. And then they asked me to raise the funds to get that done.
Mm.
So it's a lot of work. There's a lot of expense involved usually.
Yeah.
And then we end up as authors for countries where there are few evangelical believers, we end up signing away any royalties at all. So a lot of expense and don't make a penny on it. It's just kind of hard, but it's
Yeah.
as God leads. If God wants it, he makes a way,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
going to,
You never know. You never know the door he's going to open.
yeah, yeah. So I'm going to wind things up here because it's time, and the ladies from the East especially are probably ready to go to bed. So next time, ladies, if you're from the East, you could actually show up in your jammies and nobody's going to care. It's all good. It's all good. Your secrets are safe with us. So Marcy, thank you for coming. The ladies have your website address. They've got your email now too if they want to get a hold of you for any reason. And Betsy's saying thank you. So on behalf of everybody, I'm just saying thank you. And I will pray us out. Unless there's one, is there any other thing you want to add just at the very end?
Just I think one of the questions we were talking about was what advice you give to new writers, and one of the things that God has really taught me, and it's been a struggle in a way for me, to worship the giver, not the gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember who said that. I wish I could remember it. I'm going to have to try and research it and see if I can find where I found that initially, because I think that is so essential. And it's easy, especially if you begin to get known a bit for your writing and you're being praised for your writing and things are happening through your writing. It's easy to end up making your writing into an idol.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to your writing instead of to God for the things that you need. And that's been a struggle with me. As I said, God stopped me from writing fiction for a time because I had become so obsessed with it, and it was an idol in my life. And I struggle to prevent that from ever happening again, because then I think that blocks His ability to work through your work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an important thing.
Thank you. I appreciate your humble spirit. It shows. So many are saying thank you. All right. Let me pray us out.